So hi again, everyone. What I'm going to do with this video is kind of lay the foundation of the whole approach that we're going to take to stress management in this class. We are taking an approach, if you haven't realized that yet through some of the readings, of stress management by way of psychophysiology. So what is psychophysiology? Well, psychophysiology is the workings of your mind and your body and how they work together, because they absolutely cannot be separated. Your body, and when I talk about body, I'm not talking about the things from your shoulders to your toes that just kind of is this physical thing that carries you around. I mean the whole human system that you live in. I term body, including your brain, including the way it all processes together. And your mind and your body can't be separated. Your body, including your brain, is constantly reflecting everything that's going on in your mind. And then it goes back and influences what your mind does. So it's a continual feedback loop between your mind and your body and your mind and your body. And it absolutely cannot be separated. And if we understand how it all works together, what that does is give us a blueprint for change, because we can understand how our emotional lives play out in the systems of our body. And again, stress is a product of your emotional life. I don't use emotion in a negative context at all, as ungrounding and chaotic as difficult emotion can be. Well-grounded emotion may be the best asset you can develop. So, but stress is definitely when your emotional system is in chaos, and we can understand, when we can understand how our whole mind and body work together, representing our emotional systems, we can understand how it works when it's chaotic, and then how to use that as a blueprint for how then we begin to change and calm our systems, create systems that can see expansiveness and possibility instead of restriction and fear. So again, your mind-body complex is the instrument through which you experience life. Everything that you think, you feel, you perceive is all done through the workings of your body. Again, your whole mind-body complex, including your brain. And I'm not saying it comes from there, but it is constantly reflected. Every experience that you have, as long as you're humanly alive, is reflected through your mind-body complex. It's the instrument which allows you to experience life. What to think, how to feel, how to make sense of things, how to make meaning of things. And we're going to get deeper into that, but it's not also just your brain, it's your whole bodily system. Okay, so then the other really big piece here is that you have two survival drives. We all have two survival drives. These both drives had to be built into our species to be able to survive as a species. You have what's called your fear response system, and when you're in your fear response system, you're just flooded with restriction, hyper alert, hyper arousal. Your fear response system was the system that allowed our species to react out of fear, to react immediately, and be able to create safety when there were things threatening, life-threatening things happening. But we also had to have a common connection system to survive as a species, and this doesn't get talked about very much. We had to have that system built into us, a desire to create community, to love, to bond, to connect, to protect each other, or we also wouldn't have survived as a species. And when you are grounded in your common connection system, it's shown through research that you actually see differently. You see expansiveness, you see possibility. There's a theory called broaden and build theory that you actually see, because you see its expansiveness and see possibility, you take steps that you can take through that possibility, and then that builds your capacities for more. So the thing is we had to have both of these species to survive. The big thing here, the big point here is that physiologically you can't be in both at once. You are either in your fear response system or you are in your calm and connection system. They're two very, very, very different physiological states. Now, whatever state we're in, we see, perceive, behave, and react through the one that's dominant. So if you're in your fear response drive and you're in a stressed out state, you're going to see the world through that lens. It's as if we put a lens that's consistent with those states. But the other thing is that, and if you're in your common connection, you see the lens through the lens of that system. You see expansiveness, you see possibility, you see connection. And each of these systems carries a very, very, very distinct physiological imprint. I could measure every single one of you listening to this when you're in one or the other system, and it would carry a very, very distinct physiological imprint in what your neural nets are doing, and I'm going to talk about this more later, but also in your biochemistry, which are the chemicals that go throughout your whole body and tell you how to think and feel, and those carry a very, very distinct imprint from whichever system you're in. If you're grounded in your fear response system, then you're probably flooded with cortisol, which is stress hormone. If you're grounded in your calm and connection system, you probably have a lot more oxytocin, which is a calm and connection hormone. And the thing is when one of those is high, the other is usually low. They're not exactly opposite hormones, but they function very differently, and both levels can't be high in your body at the same time. So whatever distinct physiological imprint that you carry every moment of every day, you're carrying a physiological imprint of what you're thinking, how you're feeling, what you're anticipating, what you've been through, what you're going through every moment of every day. And each of these systems or survival drives are dominated by specific emotional states. In other words, when you're in your fear response system, you're dominated by worry, by overwhelm, by anxiety. When you're in your calm and connection system, you're primarily dominated by a sense of calmness, a sense of clarity, a sense of connection. So those are huge, they're just completely different states of being, but they're measurable, absolutely measurable in your body and your brain. The other really big piece of this here is that you are a system of adaptation. What does that mean? That means that every moment of every day you are adapting to your routine experience. In other words, whatever physiological imprint that you're having in every moment, you're just getting better at that. It's like exercising. The more you exercise, the better you get at exercising, or learning a math problem, or hitting a baseball. Your emotional system is the same way. The more you do anything, including experience specific emotions, the more capacity you have to do that same thing. That was a pretty fancy transition. So every moment of every day you're transforming, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. Transformation isn't something that you just do when you feel good and you feel like changing. You are transforming every moment of every day. Every moment of every day. It's always taking place. One of my favorite researchers says that our bodies are verbs, not nouns. They're not things. They're constantly changing machine, if you will. Transformation is always taking place. And it's just taking place to what you're routinely experiencing. So the more you experience any state of being, the better you get at that state of being. You are constantly creating capacities for more of your routine experience. You're constantly transforming. Sometimes we're just transforming to more of the same, which I know sounds kind of contradictory, but you are constantly transforming. You just may be transforming to more of the same. And then what happens is you think, why don't things ever change for me? Because the thing is to change, my students hear me say this all the time, nothing changes if nothing changes. So transformation is always taking place. So the idea then is to be able to change something. So when that transformation happens, it cultivates more of one of these other drives, because again, one or the other drive is always dominant. So the only way to move out of your stress response and out of a stressed filled existence is to reduce that, your fear response drive, and then actively cultivate your calm and connection drive. It's a two-step process. Okay, so the big thing is what you're transforming to is what you experience. What you routinely experience is what you're transforming more of. So if every day all you're doing is going off on your inner chatter all day long, I'm this, I'm that, I can't do anything right, I'm not good at school, nobody likes me, I don't feel comfortable in social situations, I hate my body image, whatever it is, whatever that inner chatter is telling you, you are just transforming to more of your experience. So the only way that you can authentically change is to change your experience. You are a product of your experience. One of the other things I like to say is I kind of compare it to the freeway of fear versus the highway of love. What does that mean? That means your fear response system has more neural connections, and I'm going to talk about neural connections in just a few minutes. But your fear response system has more neural connections in your brain than your calm and connection system. Why? It had to be quicker and it had to be more reactive to keep our species alive. You had to react out of fear before you were drawn to love, connection, bonding, creating community. It just didn't have to be as quick. It doesn't mean it's a stronger drive. It just means your fear response system is quicker and more reactive. It has more dedicated neurons. And you're going to see in just a little bit that whatever your neurons are doing is what you're cultivating, them more of the capacity for the same. So you actually have to put more intention into actively cultivating your calm and connection system because it has less dedicated neurons. So you actually have to intentionally create more neurons by intentionally creating more experience in your calm and connection system. And that may make more sense as we go along. So one of the stories I love, and a lot of different cultures have two versions of this same story, but I'm going to tell you in the Native American version is there's a young Native American boy, and he's talking to his grandfather, and he says, I just don't understand. It's like I've got these two wolves inside of me. And one wolf is, full of anger and hatred and always wants to fight. And then the other wolf is, very calm and wants to be in community and is very connected. And they're always fighting inside of me. And I just don't understand. I need to know which one wins. And then the grandfather tells the boy, the one that wins is the one that you feed. And then there's also a concept called planting the seeds of consciousness. And in other words, that idea is that what grows are the seeds that we plant. And the seeds that we plant are the consciousness that we're in every day. So in other words, if you're rooted in your fear response system, you're constantly rooted in your fear response system, you're just creating more seeds or more capacity, or those are growing more than the seeds of your calm and connection system. So whichever seeds you plant are what you end up cultivating in the garden of your life. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this just a little bit because this is what we're going to base our whole class on. I break this down a lot. We're going to talk about every single piece of this. So what does this mean? This is kind of a depiction of how you are constantly transforming every moment of every day. The very first thing that happens is you have some kind of perception. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to tell you how your perceptions get developed, because your perceptions are unique to you, completely individual to you. But every moment of every day, you're perceiving stuff, and you're perceiving a ton of stuff. 80 to 90% of what you perceive is beyond your awareness. You have different parts of your brain. Some of your brain is where your conscious awareness lies, and some of your brain does a lot of processing beyond your conscious awareness, and it's a good thing. Okay, sometimes you hear the word subconscious and conscious, and I use those terms, but I don't like those so much because people think the subconscious is just something, this big back dark space that you can't do anything about. And the truth is that's not what's true. Because your whole brain is made of neurons, and neurons have the capacity to change, even if it's in the part of your brain that's beyond conscious awareness. So your brain does a lot of stuff beyond conscious awareness, and that's a good thing, because you couldn't psychologically handle all the processing that your brain does at once. It would just be too much. It would be information overload, and it would be psychological breakdown. So it's really good thing that your brain processes all this stuff. It's processing things that you might hear, that you might see, that you might smell, that you might perceive, all beyond your awareness. If it kind of deems something to be strong enough or important enough, then it might come to your conscious awareness. But most of the time it's just perceiving all of this stuff going on. And I'm going to talk much more in depth about how that goes on. But then when we go to the, then we go in this arrow down here to meaning. So the minute you have a perception, somehow you make meaning of that perception. Now again, 80 to 90% of the meaning may be subconscious, and I'll tell you how that might happen in just a few minutes. But so you have a perception, you immediately make meaning of it. That meaning comes up in thoughts and emotions, and again, some of these emotions are beyond your conscious awareness. I'll tell you how that happens in just a few minutes, but you immediately make meaning. When you make meaning of something, immediately you have a physiological imprint through your whole body and brain that's consistent with that meaning. So if I perceive something as threatening, I have to go talk to a professor, and I've had problems with academic anxiety before, and I'm afraid, and so the meaning I make is that they're just going to judge me, and then I have this physiological imprint of that fear of judgment. It's going to reflect in my neural nets right here, or the neurons in your brain and the way your brain functions, the electrical system of your heart. The electrical system of your heart, I'm not just talking about the speed of your heart rate. There's something called heart rate variability, which again, we're going to get into. We're going to really break down all of this stuff a lot. I'm just kind of trying to give you an overview of where we're going. But that reflects your emotional state. And on some level, it's felt in every cell in your body. You also have biochemicals that are chemicals that go through your blood. They affect every cell and every organ in your whole body. It's not just in your brain. It affects every cell and every organ. So you have a physiological imprint. Again, say you're going to talk to a professor, you have academic anxiety, you know that you just are sure they're going to be judging you, and so you carry that physiological imprint. Well, what happens is that physiological imprint goes back and affects your perception. It's like the lens that you put on. And so then whatever that person does, you're going to perceive it in a way that's just validating how you're feeling. And this cycle goes on and on and on and on. And it can be an upward spiral, or it can be a downward spiral, or it can be kind of a status quo spiral. Most of us live in a status quo spiral, or we live in a downward kind of direction spiral. But the idea here is once you understand how all this works, you can jump in at some of these different levels and reverse the spiral and reverse what's going on. Because again, this can be a spiral of becoming under your fear response system, or it can be a spiral of becoming under your calm and connection system. Now the BRCs right here are behaviors, reactions, and choices that are consistent to whatever we're perceiving, the meaning we're making, or the physiological imprint. So let's say I have a perception and I deem that perception as threatening, and it just feels too uncomfortable. So my behavior is that I go and I eat or drink because it numbs the pain. Well, then this becomes its own spiral, right? Or I react out of fear, or react by crying, or I react by getting angry, or I make a bad choice because of whatever I'm perceiving. So all of these, again, they're always offshoots of behaviors and reactions and choices, and these things by themselves can become their own spirals. So, it can just spiral out of control depending on whatever is going on in the nature of all of this. And so again, for our class and what you've been reading about is kind of breaking down each of these pieces, because each of these pieces are really, really important to understand, because what they do is they give us a blueprint for change. When we can understand how and why we perceive the way we do, we can understand how we begin to change those perceptions, because you can, which is amazing. People didn't used to think you could change your perceptions or change the wiring in your brain, and now we know that's not true. Once you understand what the physiological imprint means, we can jump in at certain levels and we can change what's going on biochemically for us by a different change in experience, or a different change in attention, or, so we can jump in at any of these levels and begin to change that spiral once you understand how that spiral really works. But it kind of takes an understanding. And so we're going to, again, use this as the paradigm for our class, and we're going to break it apart. We're going to spend a lot of time talking on perception, and then we're going to take a lot of time talking on how we make meaning of those perceptions. We're going to take a lot of time and talk about what each of those physiological imprints look like. And then the core of the class, the most important part of this class, is then how do we jump in and begin to change it, so then this becomes an upward spiral instead of a downward spiral. So there is hope. There is absolutely hope, because understanding all of this is the thing that gives us a blueprint for change. However, just to start off with, we are going to talk about first how it works when your fear response system is active. Okay, so the seat of perception. Why do you perceive the things the way you do? Because everybody perceives differently. I always give this example when I'm in the classroom, that if a dog walked in the classroom and there may be 100 people in the classroom, there would be 100 different experiences of the same dog. And why would that be? Some people would be afraid, some people would be happy, some people would be kind of laughing about why is a dog in the classroom. Some people might be sad because they just had a dog die. I mean, there would just be a million different immediate emotional responses to the same dog. So the truth is, we don't perceive things as they are. We perceive things how we are. And that doesn't make it good or bad. It just makes it important to understand. It just makes it important to understand, because when we understand why and how we perceive the things, we can kind of stop the process if it's not working very well for us. So, deep in your brain, you have a couple different structures that are really important to what's called emotional memory or implicit memory. I don't like even that term, because memory kind of gives you the idea that it's something that you're consciously remembering. Implicit memory means it's just experience that's stored and helps you make meaning of future experience, but it's not necessarily conscious. So I'm going to talk a lot about this little thing here called the amygdala, and how that it's our meaning-making center of our brain. It tells us how to make meaning of circumstance, of whether it's safe or not safe. It's something that we should be drawn toward or repelled against, or fear. It's also associated with two different structures in your brain called the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this for a minute. The amygdala is like a little almond in your brain. It's that little yellow thing that I just showed you. It's a tiny little thing, but its job is really big. The amygdala records every experience you've ever had. and it records it in its neural nets, and I'll tell you a little bit about neural nets in a minute, but basically it's wiring. Okay, a neural net is a whole system of neurons, which are nerve cells in your brain. Nerve cells look different than regular cells, and it's like wiring. So every experience you've ever had gets wired. And because experiences are over, even if you've had really hard traumatic experiences, those experiences are over. So a lot of people would say they're over, get over it, but that's not true, because what happens is every experience you've ever had gets wired in your brain. But how it gets wired is it gets wired by degree of significance. So if something has been a more significant experience, it gets wired a little stronger. Or if something's a repeated experience, it gets wired a little stronger. So, and again, when I say experience, it doesn't necessarily have to be your first person experience. It could be a story that somebody told you because you're experiencing the story. Or it could be something you saw on the media because you're experiencing, you're experiencing seeing something, right? So it doesn't have to be a first person experience. Somehow that experience came back and formed you. Okay, and so again, the stronger the experience, the deeper it's wired in your brain. Its job is to, it's like, I like to compare it to like a really, really archaic computer with a ton of memory. And why I say it's an archaic computer is because it doesn't discern very well. In other words, it doesn't, its job isn't to try to figure intricate things out. Its job is to, just the amygdala's job, and again, other parts of your brain do other things, but your amygdala's job is to take every experience you've ever had, wire it in your brain, and its purpose is to help you make meaning of current circumstance through anything that's been wired in your past. And this is all beyond your conscious awareness. So you don't understand that it's doing it. It may or may not come to conscious awareness, but it doesn't, its job is to not say, oh yeah, this looks like that. Its job is to react pre-thought. Because in its reactive sense, in its fear response sense, its job is to react quickly, again, for our species to be able to get the heck away from danger really quick. So it's kind of a pre-thought. I mean, sometimes, like I said, if a dog walked in the door, and people would have an immediate emotional response even before they're processing that there's a dog there. Okay, so that's the amygdala's job. The amygdala's job is to just tell you how to immediately make meaning, immediately make emotional meaning of whatever's going on in your current environment. And the only way it knows to do that is from what's stored from its past experience. So why do I say it doesn't discern very well? Because the stronger the past experience, it just unloads the files that look anything similar. So, and again, this is beyond your awareness. So what happens is you attach meaning to what's in front of your face, because your prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, right here, right, wants to make sense of it. So this part of your brain that wants to make sense of it attaches that. So this makes the meaning. It just gives you a rush of a felt experience. This part of your brain wants to make meaning of it, and it attaches that meaning to a current circumstance. So, if you were at the lecture, I gave an example of you're a kid and somebody teases you about a math problem in kindergarten, and pretty soon you start telling you that gets stored in your amygdala, and then of course you keep retelling that story and retelling that story and retelling that story, and so now you have an emotional reaction every time you even take a test. Right now you have full-blown test anxiety or academic anxiety every time you take a test, even if you know it, right? You just have this fear, and your brain right here wants to make sense of it. So your brain attaches that fear to the test you're taking now, okay? Or anything. Somebody does something that looks remotely like somebody that hurt you before, or it just, and the thing is your brain isn't always consciously making the connection. In fact, it's rarely consciously making the connection unless it comes to your awareness enough. Right, this is where racism comes from. We get fed so many different images of people that look a certain way, and they just get recorded in the deeper parts of our brain, and then our front of our brain wants to make sense of it. So somebody walks in the room that looks like something that's stored here, and we all of a sudden we attach some kind of meaning to what we think that person is. Again, this is done in the bigger events of our life. It's done in the smaller events of our life. It's done in just the way we perceive everything. The way we perceive everything. Sometimes it's right on, and sometimes it's not right on. For me, I had an experience where it wasn't right on. I had, one of my kids was in a serious accident and fell into a window where he almost immediately bled to death, and he had to be taken to airlifted by helicopter to a trauma unit. And I got a phone. I wasn't home at the time. He was 16, and I got the phone call that they needed to airlift him to a trauma unit. He went straight into surgery. It was an all-night surgery. Obviously, he's fine. He's fine. I always have to tell that part of the story because I always wait, what happened? He's fine now. But what happened is my amygdala made a really strong imprint of that. So my amygdala associated helicopters with a terrible fear response. So I'd be walking across campus, and all of a sudden my heart would start racing, and I'd be panicked, and all of a sudden I'd have this terrible panic around where are my kids, and I wouldn't even hear the helicopter, because again, this is before your amygdala does it before conscious awareness. So it's like, what is going on? And then I would hear the helicopter, right? But it wasn't the helicopter wasn't the threat. That was my imprint in my amygdala, but there was nothing about a helicopter flying over Cal Poly that's a threat to me. So the amygdala's job is to alert you, but the problem is we don't hear it like that. We hear it like that alert is our all-consuming reality. Now, I kind of had two choices at that time. I could have kept retelling myself the story, even if that helicopter wasn't the threat. I could have gone back and oh my gosh, and relived the event. And all that's doing is beginning to just cement that experience, because I'm reliving the experience. So every time you also reliving an experience, you're just cementing that in your neural nets. Or I could have changed my experience altogether. And what I did, and this was a very conscious act on my part, is it was like, wait, calm down. What's really true is that helicopter was a good thing, right? And so I kind of retrained that reactive part in my brain, but it took a lot of work. So again, our amygdalas are it's the meaning-making center. When it's in its fear response role, it's hyper-reactive, hyper alert, and its job is just to alert us. Our job is to discern when that alert is appropriate. And again, the problem is we don't do that. When it alerts us, we just think we're perceiving reality the way it is, and we just take off with that reaction as if it were the truth. And the more physically felt the reaction is, the more it's about our past stored stuff. And again, it may still warrant reaction, but the stronger the felt response, the stronger the emotional response, the more it is associated with some of our past stored stuff. So it's just really important to understand. This is the one thing I wish I could give everybody in the world, this piece of knowledge. There's a lot of other things I wish I could give them in ways of practices and all that kind of stuff, but I wish that if I could give one thing to everybody in the world, it would be the knowledge about how the amygdala works, because that knowledge can free you up. That knowledge can make you understand I don't always have to react every time I perceive something as threatening, because it may or may not be threatening. And most of the time it isn't, because most of the time your amygdala is overdoing its job. Okay, so then what happens is when the amygdala detects threat, it sends a message to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is like your chemical producing factory in your brain. And so it just rains stress hormones, and I'm going to talk more in depth about that next week, but it just rains stress, or it starts the process for stress hormones to go through your whole body. Um, it's it's the thing that starts the whole process. Your hippocampus is something that we say stores autobiographical memory, meaning that it stores the memories that you can remember, which is really important to understand the difference, because the amygdala stores like the hyper alert reaction that you have, but the hippocampus stores the actual memory. And the reason why it's important to understand that difference is you can rewire what's going on in your amygdala and still keep a memory of something. Because a lot of times people say, well, I don't want to heal because I don't want to forget. Well, you know, you can heal an emotional reactivity around something and still keep the memory, still keep the autobiographical memory. You know, because a lot of people are like, you know, if they've been hurt before, it's like, I don't want to forget that. Well, you don't forget it, but you can heal your reactions around it so you can begin to live a more balanced life. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. I don't even know what that says. So again, experience programs the computer in your brain. Every experience you've ever had programs the computer, your brain. The important thing is when you begin to change experience, you begin to reprogram the computer in your brain, because it is always changing. And this is the thing that's new in our neuroscience. We didn't used to know that. We used to think what you were, you know, once you were an adult, you were what we called hardwired. You were basically the way that you were was the way that you were going to be. And now we know that's not true, because we have enough medical technology and enough people that are working, doing research. And when you intentionally change experience, and we see that your brain actually changes when you intentionally change experience. It's probably the biggest finding in neuroscience ever. It happened in the mid-1990s, and now all the research all around the brain was all from that original research, showing that we can change our brain through intentional experience. And it's the same thing with emotional experience. Okay, so again, the more the emotional impact of any event, the more the memory is stored, good and bad. Right? So when we begin to change up our experience, we can actually rewire what's going on with the emotional impact of a hard event. Implicit memory means that it's felt at some level. In other words, you may have like with my helicopter, right? I didn't even hear the helicopter at first. But implicit memory means at some level it was felt. Yeah, it was felt because my heart was racing. I was panicked. So I felt the reaction. I felt the fear reaction, but I didn't even realize consciously what it is. And, you know, after I felt this reaction, then it was like, oh, there's a helicopter. But I felt the physical reaction before I felt before I even heard the helicopter. So at some level, it's always felt. So if you can learn to tune into your bodies, you can usually tell when you're having a stress reaction, even when you're not consciously aware of what's going on. And again, that your perception is always the lens through which you perceive your world. So the only way to begin to change your perceptions is to rewire what's going on. So this is what a neural net looks like, or a neuron looks like. And one neuron doesn't do anything, but it attaches to other neurons through the way these neurons connect through synapses here, and then they transfer information. The more they connect, the stronger they get. But if they stop connecting, they will break off and die. So in other words, the more you have any repeated experience, or if you have one experience, but then you keep telling yourself stories around that same experience, I'm bad at that math problem, or, you know, nobody likes me, or, you know, I have this horrible body image, or whatever, the more you keep telling your stories, the more that you're just wiring those connections to make them long-term, make the wiring long term. So the idea is you need to break that. One of the synapse is the part of the neuron that connects, and one of my favorite authors just says, you are your synapses. So basically your synapses fire to your thoughts, your feelings, how you're interpreting things, and the more that you do that, the more you just become that thing. So, and again, the whole idea of this class is to understand how the process happens and then change it up so it works for you instead of against you. So right now we're just kind of understanding what happens, but nerve cells that fire together wire together. The more you have any experience, or the more you repeat any experience, or the more you tell yourself stories around that same experience, the more stronger they just wire together. Functional versus structural changes means that it not only changes in the moment, meaning functional changes, but you get long-term changes in what's going on in the neurons in your brain when you begin to change up experience. So all the resilience tools that we've been talking in here fundamentally change what's going on with your neural nets in the moment, and the more you do that in the moment, the more you actually change the structure of your brain. So again, where the big hope lies is in neuroplasticity, that when we begin to change experience, we begin to change the way our brain is wired. We're going to come back to this concept a lot in the class. I just kind of want to leave you with some hope. And then also we're going to go back to the perception, the spiral of becoming. And again, I just want you to look a little bit, because again, this is going to be the paradigm of our class. What I've done today is just kind of really give you an overview of what that spiral looks like, that it can be an upward spiral or a downward spiral depending on which of our main systems we are grounded in as our dominant system, either our fear response system or our common connection system. And then I just started with the very first piece of the spiral here up in perception, and kind of explained how perception happens. And so from the next several weeks, then we're going to talk about the rest of the spiral, how we make meaning, how we determine biochemical changes and electrical changes, and then how we begin to jump in and change it all up so it works for us instead of against us.